Many visionaries, and some crackpots, have made crazy cars over the decades, but usually these projects barely get off the ground. Not so here. Citroën made 1.5 million of these outrageous cars over a 20-year period. That means that for decades, they were just out there selling this thing, which is basically the physical manifestation of an acid trip, to regular old people. It was the most advanced production car in the world when it was introduced, is probably the most extraordinary mass-produced car of all time, and is among the most important cars ever made. It is La DS. Virtually every interaction with the DS begs the question of why. Why did they make this thing? Why did they make it so weird? Why did so many people buy it? The answer lies in the personalities of a few key people. First, there's André Citroën, the flamboyant showman who liked to gamble and was often in debt, repeatedly betting his company on a single idea. But they were usually good ideas. The company's chevron logo came from the double helical gear mechanism that his company started producing in 1902 and sold across Europe, eventually being used in the steering gear of the Titanic and her sister ships. During World War I, André Citroën promised the desperate French government that he could supply 10,000 shells a day, more than all the other Parisian suppliers combined. He built a factory in 5 months, and 18 months later he was supplying not 10, but 15,000 shells a day. After the war, he transitioned his focus to making cars. He deeply admired Henry Ford and wanted to produce France's equivalent of the Model T. The first car he produced, the Type A, is generally considered to be Europe's first mass-produced car, and only 6 years after starting car production in 1919, Citroën had produced 30% of the cars on France's roads. André Citroën had become one of Europe's most successful businessmen, and he built his empire on the foundation of engineering and mass production. Citroën cars were mechanically conventional and robust, with none of the peculiarities we now associate with the marque. But by the early 30s, André Citroën wanted to produce a new car that would have as long a production life as possible, and so he decided to make it very advanced. This car would become the Traction Avant. Introduced in 1934, it was chock full of cutting-edge technology like front-wheel drive, unitary construction, hydraulic brakes, independent front suspension, and from 1936 on, rack and pinion steering. The car went on to have an incredible 23-year production run, just as Mr. Citroën hoped. But early examples were plagued with technical problems, and fixing them on cars that had already been built drove the company into bankruptcy. Around the same time, André Citroën died of stomach cancer at the age of 56 in 1935. Citroën's largest creditor, Michelin, took the company over, ironed the bugs out of the Traction Avant, and within 2 years, all of Citroën's debts were repaid. Following André Citroën's death, the spirit of the company was maintained by several key members of his team who later became instrumental in developing the DS. Perhaps the most important of these was André Lefèbvre, an intensely creative, passionate engineer who was effectively a one-man think tank. He was described by colleagues as being possessed by the demon of creation. He had worked at Voisin designing airplanes and later cars, and came to Citroën in 1933 from Renault, where his outlandish ideas clashed with their traditional conservative mindset. He shaped the Traction Avant as well as Citroën's next 2 cars, both of which would go on to become icons. The second of these was the DS, but the first was the project known internally as the toute petite voiture, or very small car. Born out of a desire to mobilize the masses in the same way as Germany's Volkswagen and Italy's Fiat Topolino, the little Citroën, officially known as the 2 chevaux or 2CV, was basic but very clever. It used a platform-type chassis, front-wheel drive, inboard front brakes, and innovative suspension which gave a fantastic ride, all features that would make their way into the DS. Development of the 2 chevaux began in 1936, but the production model didn't emerge until 1948 due to the war. While one French newspaper called it a small grey abortion in metal, it was just the right thing for early post-war rural France. Durable, economical, cheap, and critically, not a donkey. Like its older and much bigger brother, the Traction Avant, the 2 chevaux was styled by Flaminio Bertoni, who would go on to also design the DS. The engineer Lefebvre and the designer Bertoni worked together in Citroën's design office called the Bureau d'études, which translates to something like the Office of Studies. In the 1930s, when the Traction Avant was just a few years old, they began work on its replacement, the eventual DS, although the war meant that they switched their focus to the 2 chevaux, since it would clearly be a more appropriate car for the austere post-war years. Once the 2 chevaux was launched in 1948, they could return their focus to the big car, which finally launched in 1955. Citroën's leadership supported the outrageous vision for the new large car. Managing director Pierre Boulanger was known for being relentlessly rational and efficient in his approach to problems, applying the philosophy of René Descartes to create the guiding philosophy of the Bureau d'études. He told the brain trust to study every possible solution, even if it seemed unreasonable. The philosophy was that there was no technology too advanced for consideration, and every inch of the Citroën DS reflects this. From the very first glance, this car's complete rejection of conventional sedan forms tells you it's going to be very, very different. Flaminio Bertoni knew that the most aerodynamic shape is a teardrop, and so does the DS. The nose slopes down dramatically, there are no formal air intakes, the rear wheels are covered, and even the wipers are concealed behind the upturned trailing edge of the hood. The underside of the car is smooth for aerodynamic reasons, and the coefficient of drag, about 0.37, is lower than that of a Ferrari Daytona, which came out a dozen years later. The wheels are pushed out to the corners of the car to improve interior space and ride quality. The wheelbase is 2 feet longer than a Range Rover's and the same length as a Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud. The car's structure is in its floor pan, and the body panels are therefore unstressed, even the roof, which was sometimes made of unpainted fiberglass. These features lower the car's center of gravity, as do the frameless windows. Outward visibility is excellent, with an unusually large greenhouse for the era, although the plunging roofline means that the rearview mirror is mounted on top of the dashboard. The rest of the interior is equally outlandish, especially in early examples. They use plastic extensively, which was quite unusual for the time. This is just the stuff you can see. The car is equally wild under the skin, perhaps more so. Like its predecessor, the DS is front-wheel drive with rack and pinion steering, and also added inboard front disc brakes, which made it the first production car with disc brakes. The car was designed around the world's first radial tire, Michelin's X, which proved to be a quantum leap over the old bias ply tires then in use. The tire and brake combination was so good that Motor Trend gave up trying to get the brakes to fade after their 60th stop from 60 miles an hour because the engine was starting to overheat during their 1956 road test. The most famous of the DS's mechanical systems is undoubtedly its hydraulics. A pump driven by the engine produces 2,400 pounds per square inch of hydraulic pressure, which actuates the suspension, transmission, brakes, and steering. The suspension is height adjustable and self-leveling, which means there's no jack needed when you change a tire. You simply lower the car, install a jack stand, raise it back up, and it lifts the wheel off the ground. The system is also clever enough to drive with one rear wheel removed, which Citroën and their salesmen were always happy to demonstrate. The ride quality this system provides is sensational, and accordingly Rolls-Royce licensed it from Citroën a decade later rather than designing their own system. Low-frequency bumps are barely perceptible, and what you do perceive comes with a moment of delay, as if there was a distant event that you only learn about later via a polite letter in the mail. The motions are incredibly fluid, and always present to some extent, like being on a waterbed or aboard a boat. Despite its softness and the comfort of the ride, it is also controlled. It doesn't have the disconnected floating feeling of an American car. The entire experience is actually pleasant and soothing. It makes the car feel like a living, breathing creature. The Citromatic gearbox is basically a manual with no clutch pedal. The clutch is hydraulically actuated by the car, like a Ferrari F1 transmission. From neutral, push the lever away for first gear and ease onto the throttle pedal, and you feel the car let the clutch out for you. For a gear change, lift off the throttle, move the lever to the next gear you want, then get back on the accelerator. Rather like a Ferrari F1, the more swiftly you're trying to go, the better it works. The next thing you'll notice is the steering. It delivers peculiar hydraulic feedback, some of which is audible, as hissing, to your hands, but not any actual steering feel from the surface of the road. The brakes are equally strange, being operated by a mushroom-shaped button on the floor next to the accelerator. It has basically no travel but is pressure sensitive, which is unnerving and initially causes much larger decelerations than the driver intends. The cloud-like suspension means that the consequences of the steering and brakes are hilariously amplified pitching and rolling that makes the already disorienting experience even wilder. The key to success is to make small, gentle inputs. Imagine yourself guiding the car along a winding country road in France with one arm out the window and a Gauloise in the corner of your mouth, and you will achieve the right magnitude and pace of inputs. It is very much a car you drive with your fingertips and a single toe, and that makes it a luxurious experience because the physical effort required is so small. The only part of the DS that's not wildly innovative is its engine. It ended up with an updated version of the Traction Avant's old pushrod inline-4, although at least it gained an aluminum cylinder head with hemispherical combustion chambers. The aerodynamic shape of the DS meant its performance was genuinely good for the era, with a top speed around 100 miles an hour depending on the version, while its extraordinary road holding and braking ability meant that it was a genuinely fast way to cover ground in the real world. These characteristics did not escape the attention of rally drivers, and the car proved to be surprisingly good at certain types of events despite its large size, complexity, and unremarkable power-to-weight ratio. Its first ever Monte Carlo outing in 1956 yielded a class win, while an overall victory followed in 1959 in a car that was essentially unmodified. In fact, it was the personal car of one of the driver's wives. Many other victories followed, and the car was particularly well suited to long-distance events with rough terrain or poor weather, where absolute speed was less important than traction, suspension travel, and reliability. The DS's technical, design, and yes, even motorsport characteristics made it an absolute sensation. A new Citroën model was a rare occurrence, and there had been years of speculation around the Traction Avant's replacement. Much of the DS's development occurred at a remote facility in the countryside where 12-foot tall walls with guards in watchtowers kept prying eyes and spy photographers away. This made the DS's impact even greater when it finally appeared at the Paris Motor Show in October of 1955. The media preview occurred the night before, and it was the third most covered event in the newspaper ever, exceeded only by the end of World War II and the death of Stalin. 750 orders were taken in the first 45 minutes, 12,000 by the end of the first day, and 80,000 by the end of the 10-day-long show. The DS represented a complete structural break with what a car should be. One journalist traveled to France simply to get a ride in a press car and said, "The one ride was worth the visit to Paris. It was something I never want to forget and something I never will." The DS was developed continuously. Station wagon and convertible body styles were added, as were lower and higher trim models. 2 external facelifts happened, along with 2 complete dashboard redesigns, and 4 different engine displacements were used in countless tunes. Even if DS production had totaled a few thousand or even a few hundred units, it would have been an impactful design. But they sold 1.45 million of them, ultimately remaining in production for 2 decades until 1975. The sheer volume of people who experienced the endless weirdness of this car and then decided that yes, this would be the perfect car to drive every day is truly shocking. It's particularly stark compared to the convergence on sameness of today's cars, where manufacturers claim that consumers will reject cars that are too different. The DS is probably the most extraordinary mass-produced car ever made. From both a technical and design standpoint, it pushed the outer limits of what a car could be. It was a spaceship on wheels, and in the 1950s, that was exactly what the world wanted. This is part of why so many were built. With the trauma and austerity of the Second World War still fresh, the DS was optimism incarnate. It looked forwards, far forwards instead of backwards. But it did so in an unmistakably French way by transforming ownership and travel into a sensorially delightful and ultimately beautiful experience. And so it presented a vision of France that was something to be proud of, a monument to both art and science, a Concorde on wheels but 10 years sooner, and available not just to the rich, but to the masses.